Close your eyes and transport yourself back to the brutal reality of the year 500. Imagine you are a Gododin warrior standing guard on a bitter, windswept northern ridge, your fingers frozen around the shaft of your spear as you peer out into the blinding, freezing gray mist. What do you see? Below you, Britannia is fracturing under the immense weight of its own chaos. You see the crumbling, moss-covered skeletons of old Roman forts, the ghosts of a fallen empire. You see smoke rising from the charred remains of rival tribal homesteads, a lawless land where petty local kings are sharpening iron in the dark, hungry for power. But it's the whispers that chill you more than the howling northern wind. Echoing through the lonely dales, the damp peat, and the heather are dark, unsettling rumors of a new kind of commander moving through these very territories. He claims no crown. He wears no royal purple. He is a Dux Bellorum, a supreme warlord named Arthur. They say he commands with the cold, lethal, mechanical discipline of a lost Roman legion, yet strikes with a desperate, terrifying native fury. He is a wild card, threatening to utterly tear down the fragile, bloody status quo of the North. Welcome to Episode 9 of the Hidden Roundtable podcast. We need to strip away centuries of myth, step directly into the mud of the year 500, and gauge the raw geopolitical pulse of the Northern Territory. The clash of iron is coming, but first we have to understand the world that built the warrior. Let's dive in.
And, to do that properly, to really understand this geopolitical sandbox, we have to establish an absolute unbreakable ground rule for the entire analysis today.
Right, the no hindsight rule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are operating strictly, uncompromisingly in the year 500 AD. There is zero historical hindsight allowed here. You, as that listener standing on the ridge, you don't know the outcome.
Yeah, you have no idea what's coming.
Right. You cannot look forward to, an eventual Anglo-Saxon victory that shapes the map of England centuries later. And you certainly can't rely on French romantic poetry written in warm continental palaces 1,000 years after the fact.
No shiny plate armor, no magic swords.
None of it. We have to strip all that away. If you are standing on that windswept ridge in the north, you are feeling the immediate, just suffocating panic of a collapsing post-Roman borderland.
It's all about immediate survival.
Yes. Events are uncertain, they're volatile, and they're right in your face. The old scaffolding of the world your grandparents knew, has completely dissolved. The people living through this have absolutely no idea what the map will look like in 10 years, let alone a century.
Okay, so let's unpack this hegemonial vacuum, because it is massive. And it's basically the key to everything that follows. We talk a lot about the fall of Rome, but that phrase feels so, distant. Almost clinical.
It does. It obscures the reality on the ground.
Right. Because in the year 500, in the northern territories of Britannia, the Roman state apparatus hasn't just retreated, it has completely evaporated.
It's just gone.
And with it went the entire economic engine that kept the northern frontier stable for hundreds of years. The coin-based economy is completely dead.
Completely dead. And we really need to emphasize what that actually means on like a Tuesday afternoon for a local leader.
Yeah, break that down.
It means the official imperial supply lines, the vast mechanized bureaucratic systems that brought grain, wine, olive oil, and most importantly, salaries to the frontier buffer states. They've just vanished into thin air.
So what you have left is this bleeding sandbox of border control. The landscape is violently realigning, and survival in this specific environment at this exact moment, it demands something totally new.
It demands mobility.
Yes. If you're a local king, you can't rely on the legions coming up the road to save you. You need your own solution. You need an elite, ironclad, heavy cavalry strike force.
Right, a highly mobile unit capable of racing across the landscape and patching the holes in a disintegrating frontier.
But here's the catch, and this is where I really want to dig in. Building and maintaining that kind of elite force in a completely collapsed economy, that has to be an absolute logistical nightmare.
Oh, it is entirely about the dirt, the stone, and the logistics.
Yeah.
It is about the brutal, everyday realities of survival. If you were a local Brythonic warlord, or say, part of the Gododin elite operating out of a defensive stronghold in what is now southern Scotland or northern England, you do not care about chivalry.
You care about calories.
You care about calories. You care about horse fodder. You care about controlling the local river crossings. If we are talking about a mobile cavalry unit, the sort of embryonic Arthurian model of warfare, we are talking about a force operating at its absolute terrifying logistical ceiling.
Hold on, let me make sure I'm picturing this right. When you say logistical ceiling, you mean they are constantly on the verge of starving, right? Like an elite cavalry unit sounds great until you realize how much a horse eats in November.
That is precisely what it means. A single warhorse requires roughly 20 to 30 pounds of forage and grain every single day just to maintain its weight and operational readiness.
And that's just one horse.
Right, especially in a cold, wet environment.
Yeah.
Now multiply that by a strike force of, say, 300 riders. You are suddenly looking at thousands of pounds of high-quality feed required daily.
Which you have to find locally.
Exactly. Without the Roman taxation system pulling grain from the south and funneling it into military granaries, how do you feed those animals through a brutal Scottish winter?
You can't just order it.
No. And how do you maintain iron-smelting operations to repair weapons and shoe horses when the industrial supply chains have snapped? You have to extract all of this locally, by force, by persuasion, or by taxing whatever farmers are left.
That paints an incredibly desperate picture. It really forces this conversation right into the mud. We aren't talking about kings and castles. We're talking about warlords frantically trying to keep their horses from starving while holding a frontier.
And we don't just have to guess at this desperation. We actually have the physical receipts in the soil.
Oh, right. You're talking about the Traprain Law silver hoard.
Yes, the Traprain Law Hoard.
Yeah.
It is perhaps the most visceral, tangible proof we have of this systemic trauma.
Set the scene for us. What is Traprain Law?
Traprain Law is this massive volcanic hill in East Lothian, Scotland. It rises up like a whaleback out of the landscape. And for centuries, it was the supreme political and ceremonial capital of the Votadini tribe.
So they were the premier Roman client buffer state.
Exactly. Rome paid them handsomely in silver and status to keep the northern tribes, like the Picts, away from Hadrian's Wall.
Right. They were essentially the paid bouncers of the Roman Empire.
That's a great way to put it. They were the bouncers.
Yeah.
And they were wildly wealthy because of it. But then we look at the archaeology of the late 5th century, right before the year 500.
And what do they find?
Archaeologists found over 23 kilograms, that's roughly 50 pounds, of spectacularly high-quality late Roman silver hastily buried in a shallow pit within a dense residential cluster on the hill.
And this wasn't just raw silver bars, right? We're talking about elite Roman tableware.
Masterpieces, really.
Yeah, there were massive platters with pagan Bacchus handles, beautiful flagons decorated with Christian Chiro monograms. These were incredible works of art, the kind of things a tribal king would display at a feast to prove his connection to the grandeur of Rome.
But they didn't just bury them carefully.
No, they systematically hacked them to pieces. They crushed them, folded them up, and converted this priceless art into raw bullion.
They did. It's called hack silver. And, you know, the psychology behind hacking up an heirloom plate is profound. It tells you that the artistic value, the cultural cachet of being Roman, it just no longer mattered.
Only the raw weight of the metal mattered.
Exactly. But the crucial forensic detail here isn't just the sheer weight of the silver or the fact that it was chopped up. It's the coins that were found alongside it in the dirt.
Ah, the siliquae.
Correct. Siliquae are small Roman silver coins. The ones found in the Traprain Hoard date to the reigns of Emperors Valens, Arcadius, and Honorius.
Which gives us a very clear timeline right at the edge of the 5th century.
Right, leading exactly into our 500 AD sandbox. But here is the smoking gun. Almost every single one of these coins is heavily clipped around the edges.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of coin clipping for the listener because it's such a fascinating indicator of sheer panic.
It really is.
Clipping means someone literally took shears and snipped off the outer edges of the silver coin, leaving the emperor's face in the middle, but shrinking the actual size and weight of the currency. It's basically a physical, real-time version of hyperinflation.
It is. This clipping is a distinctively insular British economic habit. It erupts across the island precisely because the official shipments of Roman currency cease after the year 410 AD.
The central bank is gone.
Gone. The mints in Gaul and Rome are no longer sending fresh crates of silver across the channel.
So if you are a sub-Roman commander trying to pay your troops, and you only have 100 coins, but you need to pay 200 men,
What do?
you clip the edges off the 100 coins, melt down the clippings, and forge new, unofficial coins to make up the difference. You are literally stretching the money supply by destroying its integrity.
Precisely. The clipping is the physical proof of a localized economy desperately trying to stretch a finite, dwindling resource to pay for military security.
It's just wild to think about.
Yeah. The Traprain Law Hoard wasn't pirate loot stolen from a passing ship. It was almost certainly a formal diplomatic gift from a failing Roman administration, or more likely, it was mercenary pay.
The final paycheck.
Exactly. It was a frantic final payout to a northern warband to hold the line just a little bit longer.
It's the ultimate sign of structural trauma. And to add another layer to this, you have these native artisans on Traprain Law using specialized crucibles to melt down some of these high-purity Roman platters, and they are recasting them into these massive, chunky Celtic silver chains.
Yes, the heavy silver chains.
It's like a deliberate ideological assertion of indigenous identity right at the moment their security is failing. Like they're saying, we aren't Roman anymore, we're returning to our roots.
It is a profound cultural pivot, fossilized in silver.
Wow.
And we have to look at the context of the burial itself. This immense wealth was buried in a shallow pit, not a secure, deep, monumental vault. And it was then permanently abandoned.
No one ever came back to dig it up.
No one. And that fact alone tells you everything you need to know about the geopolitical situation. It tells you that by roughly 480 or 490 AD, the Votadinian elite could no longer guarantee the security of their own historic, fortified capital.
The threat was just too much.
The threat was so immediate, so overwhelming, that they had to bury their treasury in the dirt and flee to smaller, more defensible inland redoubts.
Which brings us perfectly into the war room. We need to conduct a real-time intelligence briefing.
Let's do it.
If you are a sub-Roman commander, a dux bellorum, like this Archer figure, trying to stabilize this region in the year 500, your 360-degree threat radar is entirely saturated. The pressure is coming from every conceivable direction.
Yes.
So we need to explicitly map these threats. And honestly, I think we should rank them. Because if you're in charge of the defense, you have to prioritize. You can't fight everyone at once.
A threat ranking is exactly how a military mind in 500 AD would have to approach this. Let's pull out the map and start scanning the horizons. Let's begin at the north.
Right. So above the Firth of Forth, looking into the Scottish Highlands, you have the Pictish tribes.
Yes, the Picts.
And we need to be clear here. They aren't just disorganized, ragtag raiders running out of the woods. They are a highly organized, aggressive, and culturally robust confederation.
Extremely organized.
For centuries, the Roman legions and the buffer states kept them pinned north of the Antonine Wall. But now, with the Roman defensive patrols completely gone, the Picts are actively probing the high water marks.
They are.
They are testing the porous borders of the Gaudadan territories, looking for any weakness, any abandoned fort, any valley left unguarded.
They are a constant grinding pressure. If you leave a northern valley undefended for a month, the Picts will move in, steal the cattle, burn the granaries, and take hostages. But they are a known entity. The northern Britons had been fighting the Picts for centuries. The tactics are understood. Now, if you turn your head to the west, the situation becomes much more volatile and unpredictable.
Right. The West is an absolute mess of tribal splintering. You look toward the Cumbric-speaking factions of Strathclyde around modern-day Dumbarton Rock.
Yes.
These are people who speak a language very similar to your own. They are your Brythonic cousins. But in this post-Roman vacuum, you absolutely cannot trust them.
Not at all.
The internal tribal fracturing means that coordinated defense across the breadth of the island is almost impossible to sustain.
It's the classic tragedy of a power vacuum. Instead of uniting against external threats, these rival kingdoms are sharpening iron against each other. They are fighting over the scraps of the Roman agricultural infrastructure.
And to complicate the West even further, you have the emerging maritime presence of the Dalriada.
The Dalriada, yes.
These are the Gaelic Scots, right? Coming across the Irish Sea from County Antrim in Ireland and pushing into the western seaboard of Scotland around Argyll.
Yes. They are establishing maritime footholds, utilizing highly maneuverable curras, these hide-covered boats, to bypass land defenses and strike deep into the western sea locks.
So your western flank is this chaotic mix of treacherous cousins and aggressive Gaelic maritime raiders?
Which leaves the east.
Yes, the east. And here is where I'm going to firmly plant my flag in this war room. If I am the Dux Bellorum, the eastern maritime threat is the ultimate existential danger to the stability of the entire region.
You think so?
Absolutely. Across the North Sea, and already deeply entrenched on the eastern coast, you have Germanic Anglo-Saxon infantry columns.
Well, we need to define exactly who these Germanic groups are at this specific moment in 500 AD, because they aren't yet the massive kingdoms of Northumbria or Mercia that we see centuries later.
Right. Originally, many of these groups were laity. That's a Roman term for Federate mercenaries.
Right, they were invited in.
Exactly. In the dying days of the Roman administration, the authorities actually invited these Germanic warriors in. They settled them in coastal enclaves specifically to protect the eastern seaboard against the very Pictish and Irish raids we just talked about.
It was a strategy of fighting fire with fire. We'll pay you in land and food if you guard the beaches.
But we can trace their early footholds to very specific, highly defensible coastal sites, right? Sites like the tidal island of Inis Metcat, which we now know as Lindisfarne,
Lindisfarne, yes.
and the massive volcanic outcrop of Din Gwari, which is modern-day Bamborough. They also heavily occupied the old, crumbling Roman fort networks at the Tyne estuary.
They were very strategically placed.
But here's where it goes horribly wrong for the native Britons and why I rank them as the #1 threat. These ladies are mutating.
How so?
They are rapidly transitioning from hired defensive garrisons into autonomous, aggressive, territorial consolidators. The paychecks stopped coming from Rome. The native kings can't afford to pay them the food renders they promised.
Right.
So these Anglo-Saxon mercenaries are no longer satisfied with sitting on a cold rock by the sea. They are leveraging their incredible maritime supremacy to execute localized land grabs.
They operate entirely differently from the Picts or the Irish raiders.
Exactly. A Pictish raiding party wants to steal your cows and go home. These Anglian columns want to take your farm, kill you, and move their families in.
It's a settlement strategy.
Yes.
Yeah.
They are establishing stronghold and hinterland networks. They secure a coastal fortress like Bamberg. And then they start pushing aggressively up the river estuaries using their shallow draft boats into the fertile agricultural valleys of the interior. For my money, in the year 500, this amphibious, methodical, permanent expansion is the primary overarching threat that will eventually break the Northern Territory. If you don't stop the eastern advance, you lose the breadbasket and you lose the war.
I hear your argument, and the tactical danger of the Anglian advance is undeniably immense. But I have to aggressively push back on your ranking.
Really?
Yes, the eastern maritime incursions are highly dangerous, yes, but they are ultimately a symptom of the actual primary threat.
A symptom.
If I am sitting in that war room, I rank the internal logistical ceiling, the sheer economic implosion and the tribal splintering, as the absolute #1 existential danger to the Britons.
Wait, you think the economy is a bigger threat than heavily armed Germanic warriors actively marching up your river? That feels a bit like worrying about the mortgage while your house is actively on fire.
I'd say it is more like worrying about the water pressure in your hose while the house is on fire.
Okay, fair point.
If there's no water, you can't fight the fire, no matter how brave you are. Let's go back to the physical mechanics of maintaining that heavy cavalry strike force we discussed earlier.
Right.
How do you feed a war horse through a Scottish winter without a centralized grain supply? How do you maintain iron smelting operations for weapons, which requires massive amounts of timber and specialized labor, when you can't even trust the neighboring Cumbric kingdom not to attack your supply lines?
So you're saying the military apparatus is actively starving to death from the inside out.
Exactly. Warfare requires a massive caloric surplus. The Romano-British system was built on a vast interconnected agricultural grid. Once that grid shattered into a dozen paranoid competing tribal kingdoms, the caloric math failed.
The math just doesn't work anymore.
It doesn't. If your internal caloric math fails, and if tribal betrayals constantly fracture your coalition, an external Anglian raiding party isn't the primary threat, it's simply the final nail in the coffin. The Anglo-Saxon expansion only works. They are only able to push up those river valleys because the Brythonic internal structure is already hollowed out by economic trauma. If the British kingdoms were economically stable and united, they would have pushed those mercenaries back into the sea in a week.
I see your point. It's a systemic failure. If the foundation is completely rotted out, the house is going to fall regardless of how hard the wind blows from the east. It's just a matter of time.
Precisely.
But, let's look at how that wind actually blew, because the mechanics of how this territory was lost are fascinating. Let's transition from the immediate panic of the physical landscape to how this exact crisis, this slow-motion collapse, was permanently recorded.
In the records.
Not in contested, biased medieval manuscripts, but in the soil and the water itself. Let's talk about the linguistic fossil record.
Oh, this is one of my absolute favorite aspects of this period. We are going to analyze what is known as hydronymic stratigraphy.
Okay, let's unpack that jargon for the listener. Hydronymic stratigraphy. Basically, you're looking at layers of river names over time, right?
Exactly. The names of natural features, particularly rivers and major bodies of water, are incredibly conservative. They are the most stubborn linguistic markers on the planet.
They stick around forever.
They routinely outlast the cultures and languages that originally named them. If we look at the toponymic palimpsest of the Old North...
Hold on. Toponymic palimpsest. I love the phrase, but let's explain it. A palimpsest is like one of those medieval parchment manuscripts where a monk scraped off the old ink to write something new, but you can still see the faint traces of the original writing underneath.
Yes.
Are you saying the actual map of Britain is literally a scraped clean manuscript?
That is a perfect analogy. The map of Britain is a manuscript that has been written over multiple times by the Celts, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans. But if you look closely at the landscape, the old ink is still visible.
And what does that old ink tell us?
In the north, it serves as a fossilized map of this protracted, grinding settlement process. It completely refutes the old Victorian historical idea of a sudden, violent genocidal sweep by the Anglo-Saxons where they just wiped out the native population in a weekend.
Right. So what does this linguistic map actually look like for the region we are analyzing in 500 AD?
Well, if you map the primary river systems in the region, the massive arterial waterways like the Tweed, the Tyne, the Esk, the Almond, you will find that they all retain their ancient pre-English, P-Celtic, or Paleo-European names. They are not Germanic words.
Give me some examples of those roots.
The River Tweed, for instance, derives from an ancient Celtic root meaning to swell or to be powerful. The River Esk comes directly from the common Brythonic word as ka, which simply means water or fish abounding.
So they didn't change the names of the big rivers?
No. Now, why did these macro designations survive? Why didn't the invading Anglo-Saxons rename them the Great East River or something in Old English?
Right, why not?
Because the incoming Germanic elites absolutely needed to learn these major geographical markers from the native surviving Brythonic population.
Oh, that makes total sense. If you are an Anglian warlord trying to navigate a fleet of ships, negotiate a trade deal, or establish a territorial boundary treaty with a neighboring tribe, you have to use the name that everyone already recognizes. You can't just erase the map. You have to operate within it.
Precisely. The survival of these massive river names proves that there was a period of intense, necessary bilingual interaction. But here's the tangible linguistic proof of the infiltration, the physical receipt, if you will, of how the land was actually taken.
What is it?
Contrast those primary arterial rivers with the secondary tributaries, the smaller streams, and the micro-features of the agricultural landscape.
This is where it gets chillingly methodical. The big rivers keep their Celtic names. The Tweed stays the Tweed. But the minor streams feeding into it, the creeks that actually run through the farmlands and the valleys, they shift entirely to Old English administrative markers.
Exactly. You get names like the Blackadder Water or the Langton Burn. The native Brythonic names for the localized agricultural channels are completely systematically replaced by Old English terms like burna, meaning a small rapid stream, or waiter.
So if we use an anatomy analogy, you have the primary arteries of the landscape remaining linguistically British, but the entire capillary network of the agricultural hinterlands is methodically carved up and renamed by Anglian land tenure administrators.
Yes.
They didn't just burn everything down, they audited it. They took over the estates valley by valley, stream by stream. This phonetic drift proves it was a localized, decades-long absorption of the land.
It was bureaucratic conquest as much as a military one. They took over the mechanism of agriculture. But this linguistic reality raises a major, glaring tactical question.
Which is?
If the Anglian expansion was this insidious, this methodical, creeping up the secondary waterways valley by valley, establishing new farms and renaming the streams, how do you stop a localized land grab using a mobile heavy cavalry unit?
That is the million-dollar tactical question. A heavy cavalry force is designed for shock impact. It is designed to charge a shield wall on an open field or intercept a massive raiding party. It is absolutely not designed for policing every minor stream and forested valley in the Lothians.
No, it's not.
You can't use a sledgehammer to kill 1,000 individual ants.
Exactly. To answer how you stop it, you need a commander capable of unifying a deeply fractured tribal landscape. You need someone who can see the macro picture, who can predict the movements of these amphibious infantry columns, and who can force engagements at highly specific, strategically vital hydrographic choke points. You need a dux Bellorum,
the warlord, which requires us to rigorously deconstruct the branding engine and clarify the exact identity of this commander. Because the commander we are talking about has been buried under more myth and folklore than perhaps any other figure in human history.
Very true. Before we can deploy this commander to the river for his first great battle, we must explain why his name and the location of this very conflict were violently stripped of their northern muddy context in the centuries that followed. We have to deconstruct the myth of the name itself.
Let's do it. For a long time, there's a very popular assumption, mostly among amateur historians and romantic nationalists, that the name Arthur derived from the native Brythonic word Arturius.
Which is a fundamental, fatal phonological error.
Break that down.
It sounds compelling, but it doesn't hold up to linguistic science. Arthuries is a native Celtic construction. It combines earth, derived from the Proto-Celtic word for bear, and gu, meaning man, the bear man.
It sounds very raw and tribal, which is why people like it.
Yes, but linguistically, the vowels simply do not align. If you pronounce the native compound, it produces a short U sound. It rhymes with the word gu-er.
And as we know from the earliest written records we have, that pronunciation completely contradicts the metric poetry of the era.
It absolutely does. Modern historical linguistic consensus, which is a very rigorous discipline, proves that the true etymology of the commander's name is a direct phonetic evolution of the classical Latin family name, the nomen gentile Arturius.
Let's walk the listener through how a Roman name turns into a British legend, because languages don't just change randomly, there are rules.
Exactly. There are phonetic laws. When Latin names were absorbed into common Brythonic during the centuries of Roman occupation, they followed strict, predictable sound laws. First, the nominative Latin ending, the -itis, drops off. It is no longer necessary in the Brythonic case system.
Right.
Second, the long Latin internal vowel O shifts over time to a long O. Think of it as a high central rounded vowel. And finally, the post-vocalic consonant T, the hard T sitting after a vowel, undergoes a process called spirantization.
Spirantization. That's when a hard stop consonant softens into a breathier sound over time, right? Like how the hard T in water often softens to a D sound like water in modern American English.
Perfect analogy. In Brythonic, that hard key softens into a sound. So if you follow the mathematical rules of linguistic evolution, Arturius smoothly, predictably, becomes Arthur.
With a long U.
Critically, it is pronounced with a long U.
And the absolute undeniable proof of this is in the poetry. Specifically, the Waigedaden. For the listener who doesn't know, Waigedaden is this incredibly early, raw, heroic verse composed by the poet Enurin.
Yes, a very important text.
It's a lament for a doomed Votadinian cavalry assault at Catterick around the year 600 AD. It is basically the Iliad of the North. And in that poem, there is a passing reference to a warrior who was incredibly brave, but the poet notes he was no Arthur. It's the earliest known reference to the name.
And how is it rhymed in the poem?
Right. In the original metric structure, the name Arthur is exclusively rhymed with words ending in a long U sound. It rhymes with words like mer, meaning wall, or per, meaning pure.
It is never, ever rhymed with words ending in the short or sound, the reflex of man.
So the poets knew exactly what they were doing.
They did. They knew the difference between a prestigious, Romanized military title and a native animal epithet. This commander wasn't calling himself a bear. He was utilizing the lingering prestige of a Latin name to assert sub-Roman legitimacy, discipline, and authority over a fractured coalition of tribes.
He was branding himself as the inheritor of Roman order in a world of chaos. But that raw northern sub-Roman reality didn't survive intact in the literature. It was subjected to what we can only call a campaign of textual gerrymandering.
Textual gerrymandering. That is one of the most effective, deliberate PR hijacks in literary history.
It really is.
It happens hundreds of years later, primarily in the 12th century. Anglo-Norman chroniclers, specifically writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth, executed a coordinated geographic hijack of the Arthurian reality.
We need to look at their motives. After the Norman conquest of 1066, the new rulers of Britain needed a founding mythology that wasn't Anglo-Saxon. They wanted a legendary British king to justify their own imperial ambitions.
Yes, a unifying figure.
But the real Arthur, a grim, mud-soaked warlord fighting a desperate defense against Anglian mercenaries in the freezing bogs of the Scottish borders, was not palatable to a 12th century audience.
They needed a polished, courtly mascot for the continental courts of London and Paris. They needed knights in shining armor, castles, and jousting. So they took this raw, wet northern context and they literally shoved it hundreds of miles south on the map.
Relocated him entirely.
Yes, they relocated him to Cornwall, to Somerset, to places like Tintagel and Glastonbury.
And they utilized distinct geographical discrepancies to achieve this sleight of hand. Let's look closely at the Cornovi discrepancy, because this is the absolute proof of the geographical manipulation. The name Cornwall comes directly from the tribal name of the Cornovi.
But the trick is, ancient Britain did not possess a single, unified Cornish territory in the southwest.
Wait, really? Break that down.
No, it did not. There were actually three entirely distinct, geographically separated tribal groups bearing that exact same name. There was one group located in the West Midlands, around modern Cheshire and Shropshire. There was another group located in the far, freezing northern tip of Scotland in Caithness. And only much later, a subset coalesced in the southwest peninsula that we now call Cornwall.
Oh, wow. So when a medieval monk is sitting in scriptorium in the 12th century, and he finds a fragmented 500-year-old Welsh text that references Arthur fighting alongside, or in the lands of, the Cornoviae,
What does he assume?
that monk automatically assumed it meant the modern southwest of England because that was the only Cornwall he knew. It's a fatal geographical error based on tribal displacement over centuries.
Exactly. It allowed them to drag the northern place names across the map like luggage. They took oral memories of northern campaigns or battles fought in the Midlands and anchored them in the contemporary 12th century Cornwall of their own day. They literally rewrote the map to fit their political needs.
And honestly, if you take a step back and think about it from a macro-strategic perspective, from the perspective of a military commander in the year 500, the tactical absurdity of this southern branding is glaringly obvious.
It makes no sense.
Let's think about it. Why would a sub-Roman high-speed frontier cavalry force a unit specifically designed to plug the holes in the collapsing northern buffer state against Picts and Anglian mercenaries be deployed to fight standard infantry incursions in landlocked southern valleys?
It makes absolutely zero operational sense.
It would be like deploying a squadron of Apache helicopters to manage traffic in a rural village. If Arthur is in Somerset, he is hundreds of miles away from the critical strategic choke points of Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine frontier.
Yes.
And that is exactly where the remaining Roman infrastructure was built. That's where the roads are, that's where the forts are, that's where you need heavy interception to stop an invasion.
The tactical reality absolutely demands a northern theater. The logistical ceiling we discussed earlier, the caloric math of feeding hundreds of war horses, prohibits this force from parading across the entire length of Britain to fight random skirmishes in the south.
They literally can't afford to travel.
No. They are locked in a regional, desperate war of attrition in the Old North. They cannot leave.
Yeah.
And to prove that definitively, we have to look at the hydrographic forensics of his very first recorded interception.
Which brings us to the main event. We are going into the deep dive of the battle itself. Listener, I want you to close your eyes again. Erase the image of a green, sunny meadow with knights on horseback.
Completely erase it.
Close your eyes and picture yourself standing at the confluence of the River Glen and the River Till. The sky is an oppressive bruised purple. The air smells of freezing mud, wet animal fur, and wood smoke. Before you is a highly restricted, swampy valley bottleneck shadowed by the massive volcanic height of Yevering Bell.
This is the raw physical context of the text attributed to the 9th century historian Nennius. In his Historia Britonum, he lists the 12 great battles of Arthur. The very first battle on that list is recorded with a specific geographical marker. He writes that it occurred in Ostium Fluminis quod dissiter Glein, at the mouth of the river which is called Glein.
So to establish the physical reality of this fight, we have to analyze the word Glein itself. Let's do the linguistics first. What does Glein mean?
It derives from the Brythonic adjective glano, which means clean, pure, or sacred. Now, looking at the hydrography of Britain, we have two primary river systems that philologically conform to this exact ancient hydronym.
What are the two options?
We have the Lincolnshire Glen, far to the south, and the Northumberland Glen, right up in the northern borderlands.
Right, so let's put them head-to-head in a war game scenario. A lot of older historians tried to place this battle at the Lincolnshire Glen to try and split the difference between the north and the south.
Which is a mistake.
Let's look at the geography. If we look at the Lincolnshire Glen, it rises in the southern limestone ridge and flows eastward through the fens, eventually emptying into the incredibly flat, tidal mudflats of the Wash on the east coast.
The tactical and demographic parameters of the Lincolnshire Candidate make zero operational sense for this specific conflict in the year 500.
Why is that?
We know from archaeological evidence that by the late 5th century, the region of Lindsey, where this river is, was already a mature, heavily populated Anglian demographic core. They had been settled there for generations.
So if Arthur attacks there, he's basically launching an invasion into enemy territory.
Exactly. A battle at the mouth of the Lincolnshire Glen would represent an open terrain engagement in marshy, waterlogged lowlands, requiring incredibly complex amphibious maneuvers against an established, dug-in enemy heartland.
And they just didn't have the resources for that.
Right. Unless this was a massive, unprecedented offensive of temporary reconquest, which, as we've established, the sub-Roman forces lacked the caloric and demographic strength to execute, it is historically highly improbable. They didn't have the logistics to launch D-Day into the fens.
Which leaves us with the true location, the Northumberland Glen. This fits every single tactical requirement perfectly. This is a fast, 7-mile-long tributary flowing directly out of the rutted Cheviot Hills, running straight through the valley of Glendale.
Yes.
Crucially, as we mentioned in the vignette, it sits right in the shadow of the massive Votadinian hill fort at Yevering Bell.
Yevering Bell is the key. It was a massive, ancient, native stronghold. It is exactly the kind of place a Brythonic warlord would use as an anchor for his defensive line.
Because of the vantage point?
Partly, but look closer at the topographic choke point. Nennius specifically uses the word ostium, meaning the mouth or confluence. He means the exact spot where the fast-flowing River Glen meets the slower, deeper waters of the River Till.
What happens geographically at that confluence?
It creates a highly restricted, swampy valley bottleneck. The water spreads out, the ground turns to moranic, mud-thick glacial clay that sucks at your boots. This isn't just a scenic backdrop for a poem. This is the natural geographical gateway.
It's a strategic funnel.
It is the absolute choke point controlling movement between the coastal Anglian enclaves at Bamberg and Lindisfarne to the east, and the fertile, vital inland plains of the Tweed Valley to the west.
So if the Anglians want to expand inland and take the farms, they have to march through this swamp.
They have no other route for a large infantry column.
This changes everything about how we understand Arthurian warfare. It was not a chaotic skirmish. It was not a heroic duel between kings. It was a textbook, ruthlessly calculated defensive interception.
It was a trap.
Let's break down the mechanics of how this battle was actually fought on that day. Let's play general.
The Anglian amphibious infantry have landed or marched from the coast. Their goal is to exploit the agricultural heartlands to feed their growing stronghold networks.
Right. They are marching inland, moving up the river valleys in a massive, heavily armed column.
Meanwhile, the sub-Roman forces, the native coalition led by our Dix Bellorum, Arturius, are operating out of the decaying but structurally intact infrastructure of Hadrian's Wall to the south.
Right, the wall is still there.
And they have a massive, game-changing logistical advantage that the Anglians do not possess. They have the Roman military road network.
Specifically, they have the Devil's Causeway. This is the eastern branch of the Great Roman Road known as Dare Street. This paved highway runs straight northeast from the wall, bypassing the swamps and forests, terminating directly at the Northumberland Glen.
So while the Anglian infantry is slogging through the unpaved coastal mud at 2 or 3 miles an hour, the sub-Roman commander uses the old Roman highway as a rapid transit network.
It's like taking the interstate while the enemy is on a dirt road.
Exactly. He deploys his mobile heavy cavalry units north at high speed. They can cover 20 or 30 miles in a day. They completely outmaneuver the marching Anglians. They beat them to the gateway.
They get to the confluence first and they set the trap. By meeting the invaders exactly where the fast-flowing glen hits the deeper, sluggish till, Arturius dictates the terms of the engagement.
He does.
He takes a mobile cavalry force and uses them to anchor an infantry trap. He turned that river crossing into an absolute killing zone.
We have to analyze the physics of this engagement. The Anglian war machine relies entirely on the shield wall. It is a terrifying formation, hundreds of men locked together, shields overlapping, pushing forward like an armored bulldozer.
But a shield wall relies on two things to function, right? Tight formation and solid level ground.
Exactly. If a shield wall steps into a ditch or trips over rocks, the wall breaks and the men die.
So by forcing the Anglians to cross the freezing, swampy confluence of the Glen and the Till, the British forces nullified the superior numbers and the tactical cohesion of the Germanic infantry. You cannot hold a tight shield wall when you are wading in freezing water up to your waist, sinking into glacial mud.
You just can't.
Listener, we have to eradicate all notions of chivalry here. Completely erase it from your mind. This isn't two knights charging across a manicured tournament field with trumpets playing.
No.
This is the mud and blood receipt of early medieval warfare. Imagine the suffocating, terrifying, close-quarter slaughter inside those watercourses.
The sensory reality is horrifying. The invading Anglian shield wall is forced to wade through the rapid water. They are sinking into the moranic mud. They can barely lift their feet.
And as they are struggling, what's happening to them?
They are taking a relentless, devastating rain of projectile fire javelins, arrows, sling stones from the higher defensible banks where the British forces are dug in.
And think about the weapons themselves.
Yeah.
We talk about spears and shields, but let's look at the materials. The physical reality of this fight is the shattering, bone-jarring impact of British ashwood spears slamming into Anglian limewood shields.
Limewood is specifically chosen for shields because it doesn't shatter like oak. It catches and binds the spearhead.
So an Anglian warrior blocks a thrust, the spear gets stuck in his shield, and suddenly his arm is weighed down by a 6-foot ash pole while he's trying to balance in freezing mud.
It is a meat grinder of pure attrition. It is men holding a freezing river line, screaming, slipping on submerged rocks. They are coated in woad, sweat, blood, and animal fat to keep out the cold.
The water around them is literally turning red. The victory at the Glen is not glorious in the romantic sense. There are no speeches. It is a brutal, desperate, mathematical calculation.
Yes.
It is simply a pile of waterlogged corpses damming up the river, buying temporary border security for the local native farms for one more season.
That is exactly what it was, a temporary stay of execution.
But that raises the tragic conclusion to the story. How do we know that this temporary security eventually failed? How do we know that this defensive line, bought with so much blood and brilliant tactical maneuvering at the river, ultimately collapsed in the decades that followed?
We know because the soil right next to the battlefield tells the rest of the story. The archaeology finishes the narrative that the poetry started.
Right.
We have to look at the structural microstratigraphy of a site called Yevering, known historically in the texts as Gefrin.
This site is situated on a gravel terrace right below the massive hill fort, just a stone's throw from the battlefield we just described.
Yes. The archaeological excavations here, primarily those conducted in the mid-20th century, give us a literal physical timeline etched into the dirt. It records the total transition from Brythonic native hegemony to absolute Anglian domination.
Let's trace that occupation layer by layer, because the psychological architecture here is intense. It's almost vindictive.
It is.
Long before the Anglians arrived, before the year 500, Yevering was a deeply sacred native landscape. The sub-Roman British population had established a major ritual and administrative center here. It was structured around an ancient Bronze Age burrow and a prehistoric Stonehenge. The landscape had memory.
And the earliest post-Roman graves found on the site were dug in a highly specific radial layout. They were arranged in a circle pointing inward, centered on a massive wooden post setting.
So it's very deliberate.
Yes, it is a purely indigenous Brythonic burial rite. It screams, "This is our ancestral land."
And alongside that cemetery, you have what archaeologists call the Great Inclosion. It was a massive, double-palisaded timber cattle corral and assemble space.
Which was incredibly important.
Right, because in a non-coin economy, cows are your currency. This corral was the Fort Knox of the region. This was where the sub-Roman authorities collected food renders, traded cattle, and administered local justice. It was the economic and legal heart of the native community.
Exactly.
Now, what is fascinating, what is truly critical to observe about the mindset of the conquerors, is what happens when the Bernician Anglians eventually push past the River Glen in the late 6th century and take over this site. They do not destroy these native features.
Which is counterintuitive to how we normally think of conquest.
Right. You'd think they would burn the cemetery to the ground, salt the earth, and build their own fort somewhere else to show they won. But they don't. They appropriate it.
They deliberately construct their massive Royal Timber Halls buildings, designated by archaeologists as A1 through A4, directly adjacent to and in perfect mathematical alignment with the radial British cemetery and the ancient Bronze Age barrow.
Wow.
The longitudinal axes of these massive Germanic halls are positioned to lock exactly into the older Brythonic layout.
Why do that? Why build your house next to the graves of the people you just conquered?
Because it is a psychological weapon. They are actively attempting to absorb and co-opt the ancestral legitimacy of the native populations they are now ruling. They are saying, we are the new chiefs, but we command the power of your old ancestors.
They took control of the physical economic infrastructure, the cattle corrals, shifting the destination of the agricultural surplus from British chiefs to Anglian warlords.
And the ultimate physical manifestation of that psychological dominance, the absolute flex, is the assembly theater they built.
Yes, the wooden theater. It is an incredible piece of architecture.
They build this highly unique, massive, wedge-shaped timber auditorium right there on the site. It actually borrows its architectural form from Roman provincial stone theaters, but it is built entirely out of heavy timber.
And look at where they place it. It is positioned directly between the new Anglian mead halls and the ancient Brythonic burial barrow.
Right. The entire purpose of this structure is spatial dominance. It is designed to provide a massive, elevated stage where a very small, localized minority of Anglian kings and warriors could address and legally dominate a massive, predominantly British native population.
They forced them to come there.
They used the deep-seated traditional assembly habits of the locals who were used to gathering at this spot for centuries to enforce their new laws and collect their taxes. It's an architectural mechanism of control.
Some management tactics never change, right? Call a mandatory all-hands meeting in a new auditorium to assert dominance and lay out the new corporate structure.
Pretty much.
But we also know this transition was not entirely peaceful. The natives didn't just sit in the theater and accept it. The soil proves there was massive resistance.
It does. When archaeologists dug through the post holes of those great timber halls, specifically buildings A1 and A3, they found distinct high-temperature burn layers in the microstratigraphy.
Let's explain that. How do we know these aren't just accidental kitchen fires? Hall fires happened all the time in the medieval period.
We know because of the temperature and the uniformity of the ash, a kitchen fire leaves localized burning. These layers create massive, intense, structure-wide conflagrations that cause the complete structural collapse of the halls.
So it wasn't just an accident.
No, the timber beams burn so hot they bake the surrounding clay. This represents hostile arson. This is warfare.
Yes, and the absolute chronological synchronization of these burn layers, dated through radiocarbon and artifact analysis, points directly to the late 6th century campaigns of the British Northern Coalition. Leaders like Urien of Ragid and Morgan Bulk of Bernacia, long after Arthur was dead, long after the initial Battle of the Glen, these native leaders were launching incredibly violent Brythonic counteroffensives. They repeatedly targeted these massive timber halls because they were the highly symbolic centers of Anglian power.
They burned them down.
They burned them to the ground, the Anglians rebuilt them, and the Britons burned them down again. The border remained a volatile, bleeding edge for generations. It wasn't over in 500 AD.
It was a protracted agony. The soil at Yevering records a century of trauma, rebuilding, and fire.
So if we synthesize this entire extraction process, this 1,500-year cold case file we've been opening up today, it is truly staggering.
It is.
We have meticulously traced how a desperate, muddy marker of northern Marcher resistance fought at a highly specific, strategic, hydrographic choke point to halt a maritime infantry invasion was systematically mutated over a millennium.
Twisted completely out of shape.
It went from a horrific, freezing war of attrition in the Northumbrian watercourses to a sanitized, courtly southern myth involving magic swords and chivalric romance entirely designed for 12th century continental politics. We lost the truth to PR.
But the earth remembers. The forensic sign-off here is undeniable. The physical receipts of the very first battle of the Arthurian legend, the dirt, the stone, the clipped hack silver, the weaponized river confluences, and the generational trauma were never born in a French palace or a sunny southwestern castle.
No.
They remain permanently etched into the volcanic strongholds, the river basins, and the microstratigraphy of the northern frontier.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to carry with you today. Consider the survival of those major river names we discussed earlier, like the Tweed and the Tyne.
The ancient Celtic words that stubbornly refuse to die.
Right. What if their preservation wasn't merely a navigational convenience for the incoming Anglo-Saxons? What if it was the result of desperate, undocumented treaties? What if those enduring Celtic hydronyms are actually the linguistic scars of a native population negotiating its own survival, carving their identity into the water itself when the land was inevitably taken from them? Something to think about the next time you look at a map.
As the echoes of the clash at the River Glen finally fade into the northern mist, we find ourselves standing on a very different landscape than the one we stepped into at the start of this hour. The mud of the year 500 is still fresh on our boots, but the geopolitical chessboard has irrevocably shifted.
It really has. We've managed to strip away the glittering armor of medieval romance and look directly at the raw, tactical reality of a Dux Bellorum operating in a fractured, volatile world. And to our listeners who have stuck with us through this extended, deep dive journey into the mud and the blood, thank you. Your company on these windswept ridges makes this meticulous excavation of history worth every step.
Absolutely. Your support is what drives us to keep digging deeper. But remember, listeners, this is only the beginning. Today, we have successfully covered the first of Arthur's 12 legendary battles. One victory carved out of the chaos, but 11 more trials of iron await him in the dark.
The campaign is long, the alliances are fragile, and the shadows of the Old North are only growing deeper. Close your eyes one last time and imagine that freezing mist rolling back over the Glen. The campaign has begun, and the road ahead is long.
Until next time on the Hidden Roundtable, keep your iron sharp and watch the horizon.